Okay, thank you all for joining us. I am so glad that you are able to connect in and that we've got our technology working for us. So this evening, we are going to have our first of the webinars on the constitutional amendments with the legislation that has come from General Conference that will need attention during annual conference. This evening, we are focusing on ballot one, which is worldwide regionalization. And this session will last us a little over an hour. We'll explore what regionalization means, how it would change the structure of the United Methodist Church, and the questions and concerns that it potentially raises. And as always, our goal is to inform you, equip you, and empower you to understand what's on the table, to discern faithfully, and to guide your congregations with care. And so we'd like to just quickly introduce ourselves. I'm Kathleen Kind of Kathy Kind. I serve as the Director of Connectional Ministries. And Jake, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jake Waybright, and I serve as a pastor at Carlisle United Methodist Church.
Thank you, Jake. And Gary.
Kathy, thank you. My name is Gary Weaver, and I presently serve as the superintendent for the River Valley District. And for the sake of this evening's conversation, I'm also a member of the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters.
Thank you. And you all had heard from Matthew Shinneman as we were beginning. Matthew is serving as our Director of Communications and is navigating the slides that are before us. So it's good to see you all. Our objectives for this evening. So tonight we have 5 objectives. They are to understand the structure of the United Methodist Church as it currently exists, to learn what regionalization proposes and why, explore theological, missional, and practical rationale, and address questions and concerns, and then offer questions for personal and congregational discernment. And so, Jake, I'm going to turn to you to see if you can get us started with the information that we need to know. And as I'm turning this to Jake, I do want to remind us that the Q&A feature exists. And as you have questions regarding regionalization, if you would please capture them in the Q&A, not in the chat. They'll get lost in the chat for us. But if you can capture them in the Q&A, we want to make sure we answer all the questions that arise during our conversation. Jake?
All right, thanks, Kathy. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And tonight we're going to talk about this regionalization, constitutional amendments that go along with that. And in order to think about regionalization, the place where we really need to start is to get our minds and get our heads in the space of thinking for a little bit about the worldwide nature of the United Methodist Church and what the United Methodist Church is outside of the U.S. And so I don't know about you, but my mind is very much in Carlisle at the moment as we start tonight. And so I want to help us think a little bit about some of the other places around the world that that there are United Methodists, that the United Methodist Church and ministry and mission is active. And so I want you to put in the chat, have you ever either been to somewhere part of the United Methodist Church outside of the United States? So have you been somewhere outside the United States and experienced the United Methodist Church? Or have you built a relationship in some way with someone who's part of the United Methodist Church outside of the United States? And if you have, I'd like you to put into the chat the name of that place where you have experienced the United Methodist Church outside of the U.S. And go ahead, type that in, and let's see where everybody has experienced that. Sierra Leone, right? I've been to Sierra Leone as well. It's one of the places that we have had some church partnerships for a long time. Lithuania, Mexico, Zimbabwe, Bolivia, Ukraine, Austria, Vienna, Austria, Uruguay, Haiti, Ireland. Let's see. Anyone else have any other countries to pull up? UAE. All right. Yeah. United Arab Emirates, China and Laos. All right. So, as we think about these places that we've experienced the United Methodist Church outside of the U.S., I want you to think about those people or those places, maybe that you can picture and that you can think about, and hold those places outside of the U.S. in your mind as we think about regionalization. So, I want to go for a quick overview for folks, a reminder for most of us. For some of you, it might be new about the United Methodist presence around the world. So you'll see on the next slide, you'll see a map that is the most recent map that we have from GCF&A, General Council of Finance and Administration, of the United Methodist Church presence around the world. You can see the one change on this. This is actually from 2016, and they haven't give us an updated one. The one big change on it is the big red that's Russia and Eurasia. Is now an autonomous Methodist denomination. And so they are no longer United Methodist, but everywhere else that you see colors is part of the United Methodist Church. So we really are a worldwide church around the world. Now, if you look on the next slide, you'll see that outside of the United States, the United Methodist Church is organized into something that we call central conferences. Central conferences were created as part of the United Methodist Church when it began as a church that was primarily in the United States, but had missionary areas that were organized into central conferences. At a time when a majority of the United Methodist Church was United Methodist, unlike today, where about half of United Methodists are outside of the United States and half are inside. So all of the churches outside the United States are organized into central conferences. There are 8 of those. You see those 4 listed in Africa, 3 in Europe, and 1 in the Philippines. To visualize that a little bit, you can look on the next slide. This is what the central conferences look like in Africa as of 2025. One new central conference was added in Africa as of January 1, 2025, to reflect the growth of the church and of disciples and United Methodist churches in Africa, to administer and do that well. The next slide shows you pictures of the central conferences as they are in the Philippines on the right, and then also in Europe on the left. One of the interesting things I thought that came, speaking about the interesting nature of the worldwide church, as of this last general conference, the Philippines, which is one central conference with 3 annual conferences that you see on the right, one of the things that was accepted at the last general conference is it turns out that the Philippines Central Conference now also includes parts of the Middle East, United Arab Emirates and Qatar, I believe it is. And in those places, we got to sit and talk to some of the folks from the Philippines who were at General Conference. And it turns out that those countries have a lot of migrant workers who come in and do a lot of the construction and other work in those countries. And many of them come from the Philippines. And Methodist lay people have, as they move to these places, have established churches there, missionary churches in those areas. And so now, in light of that, and to recognize that, the Central Conference of Philippines also includes parts of the Middle East. Now, when you think about these different regions these different regions around the world, these many different central conferences, you could really think about and picture the many different legal, cultural, and just kind of legal, cultural, and just diverse kind of settings that these places are. You can think about many of the ways that different parts of organization, administration would have to be adapted for these various areas for their unique setting. This can be all sorts of different ways. So there are parts of the world, for example, for ordination standards in education, where there are areas where there is no Master of Divinity degree. So while in the U.S., you need to do a Master of Divinity degree or its equivalent to move towards ordination. That's not possible in some other places. So they create their own ordination standards. Regional conferences have always had the ability to adapt the organization and administration parts of the Book of Discipline to meet their context and their contextual needs. One of the other kind of examples, I know many of you have been to Sierra Leone. I've traveled to Sierra Leone in a partnership from Camp Hill. And the way property is handled is very different there, where paramount chiefs in the different areas have a lot of say over what happens with the property. And it's a completely different legal context. And so each of those contexts, the regions adapt to the context in which they're in. And so, what is regionalization? So, maybe that gets you thinking a little bit about the worldwide nature of the church, about half inside, half outside, and still organized as the way the church was created, as was created over 50 years ago at its inception, as a U.S.-based church with missionary conferences. It's still organized that way. But the truth is that the United Methodist Church has changed a lot in the last 50 years. And as it has changed and adapted, that basic structure has not changed. So regionalization, at its core, is asking this question: what would it look like to structure the worldwide church in a way that is more effective, more efficient, less unwieldy, and allows for ministry to happen in every context in the best way that's most effective for making disciples in every place around the world? Um, and so there are a few things that are a part of that idea. Um, One of the things, so the first piece is a very practical thing. So at its very basic, regionalization, and Gary will go into a little more detail about this later, um, renames the 8 central conferences into regional conferences. And then the United States becomes a 9th regional conference. So basically, every United Methodist around the world becomes part of a regional conference. So they all are equal in the structure. This move then partially will, if you look on the next slide, part of what the desire of this regionalization is to create equity across the church without privileging one region as the center and others as the periphery. Because while that's how the United Methodist Church originally formed and how it came about, that's no longer true of the United Methodist Church in practice. But our structures still reflect that kind of the U.S. at the center and these other missionary conferences. This structure actually helps us all be equal at the table, have all equal standing, and then everybody, including the U.S., is able to adapt in their own regions, organization, and administration to best meet the needs of their areas. In essence, Christ and the mission of the church become the center instead of the United States in our structure. The goal is quite simple. It allows each United Methodist region to best serve the unique needs in their communities. And it's a structural adaptation that's meant to do that better. This really does help each person in each reality live out that mission of making disciples for the transformation of the world more faithfully and effectively. Now, when I think about this, I think about the way that this also will transform General Conference. General Conference is the legislative body that meets every 4 years. It gathers delegates from all of the regions, all of the areas of the United Methodist Church together for 2 weeks. Some people are there for 3 weeks or 4 weeks for this gathering. Currently, because the United States is not a regional conference, much of the organization and administration, much of the U.S. needs that are only applied to United States context have to be dealt with all of the delegates from around the world, and so this can become quite unwieldy in the in the legislative process. And so I'd give you just 2 examples of how this often happens. And this unwieldy process often ends up where folks outside of the United States often feel like they are kind of backseat. They're sitting in the backseat instead of sitting at the table together because we're talking about things that don't apply to them at all. We are talking about U.S. concerns instead of what unites us, things that connect us together, and it spends a lot of time in that process. So 2 examples, as I said before. The first example from this last General Conference was something that came to General Conference to change the pension plans for United States clergy and other workers in the United Methodist Church. Now, this legislation only impacted United States churches and clergy. It did every other region across the U.S. So half of the people who were gathered there, it had no impact on them in any way. And so we spent a significant amount of energy at General Conference with people gathered from all of the world, focused on something that only affected people in the U.S. What that also meant is that when it came time to vote on how the pension plan for the United States clergy would be structured, we had people from other regions for whom this had no impact, and in places where pension systems are completely different, voting on what our pension would be, whereas the regional conferences, they make those decisions in their own region without input to us. So you can think about that inefficiency, the time, the energy, the resources that are used to fly folks from around the world to listen to us and then to vote on things that don't have any impact on them. The second example that I think about is in my legislative committee at General Conference. I sat in my legislative committee next to Pastor Cabella. Pastor Cabella didn't speak much English. He's from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and French is his primary language. He would show up every day. We'd look for each other. He'd sit beside me because I had a laptop and he didn't, and we'd pull up whatever legislation we were talking about. We were in the ordination section, and I'd put it into French and English, and he'd read the French, I'd read the English. We had a translator there to help him translate it. To translate into English when he wanted to speak or communicate in some way with the session. And we sat at the table together, kind of doing this together. What I realized later was that that this ordination section that we were working on together for an entire week, sitting together, slogging through, right, in these legislative sessions, that much of what we talked about was actually only relevant to the way ordination happens in the US because the Democratic Republic of Congo, as a regional conference, adapts their own ordination standards and other kind of things. So, for example, we spent a lot of time at one time talking about what medical forms were required during the ordination process, something that nobody has to do at all in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so really we were taking a week of his time flying from the Democratic Republic of Congo for something that actually did not apply to him, and it's just inefficient, right, in a lot of ways, and ineffective. So General Conference would be transformed because those folks would only have to do those things that they would have to do. When I think about sitting beside Pastor Cabay, I also think about the part of Revelation, actually, in Revelation, when the kingdom of God comes on earth and we're stand at the heavenly throne, it says that people of every tribe, nation, language, and tongue will gather together with equal footing at a place of the throne, and will worship together. And a lot of General Conference, when we're together, feels like that. But the structure of our church actually are not set up like that. What a lot of people in other parts of the United Methodist Church experience is that they don't always have an equal place at the table, the way that Pastor Cabea and I did in that setting. That actually they feel like they don't have equal place at the table often at times, and an equal place there. And part of what regionalization does, and I think a majority of folks at General Conference from outside of the U.S. understood this. It actually gives us all an equal place a place at the table, that we don't have to wait till we get into the heavenly court to have an equal standing and equal place together. That's why the regionalization legislation that you'll hear a few more details about from Gary and from Kathy in a few minutes actually originated and was driven by people by United Methodist outside of the United States. So this regionalization did not originate with and did not originally come from delegates from the United States. It came from the current central conferences. And this is actually one of the realities that sometimes you may hear people who are trying to be disruptive or say fake news that this isn't something that those outside of the U.S. Would want to say, but that actually couldn't be further from the truth. This actually comes from the people outside of the U.S. And it comes from them because they are excited about the idea that we would all have an equal place around the table. We would all have equal standing within the church. We would all be organized in a way that we all have equal voice and representation within the church. Equal ability to adapt to our own regions, general conference that doesn't spend as much time on U.S.-centered concerns, and a church that really moves towards and tries to express that kind of beauty of all people of all nations, tribes, and tongues worshiping together with Christ at the center and the mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And so as we think about this, before we transition to Gary, I want you to think about this and not just hear that from me or not just hear that from us, but take a listen to this video that has voices from around the world talking about their excitement about what the United Methodist Church could become if regionalization were to pass.
The goal of regionalization is to be able to honor who we are as a worldwide denomination and to be able to honor the contextual, missional realities of each of those regions.
So we are moving toward a church that is truly global, and this is very important because there are so many good experiences, not only in Europe, in Africa, on the Philippines, and in the US. And if we bring together our gifts, that could really enrich our church and help us to be in mission with our people.
Regionalization is going to change the way we think about the church. We used to be a US church with satellites in different parts of the world. Now we'll become a truly global church, where we relate to each other on a more equal level and where our focus will be on what we're doing together in mission, in serving the poor, in education, social justice. I believe we are moving into a new and bright future for the United Methodist Church.
We don't want anybody to be at the center except for our Lord Jesus Christ, and all of us will exist with total equity, sharing the gifts and the resources that we may offer to each other, so that the spirituality called United Methodist will grow and flourish in different contexts and in different parts of the world.
And I have such this great sense of hope that we're going to be able to be that body of Christ that God yearns us to be, where we're able to be the hands and feet and heart for the whole world. And just so grateful for the way in which we're open to following the Spirit and holding tenderly the fear and anxiety that we might have, but trusting that where God is leading us will allow our fears to dissipate.
It's really the beginning of the entire process. There are many issues to deal with, but we need to start somewhere. And that's what I think the General Conference of 2024 has done, to start from somewhere so that maybe in the future we keep on reflecting on how we do our ministry in a better way.
So it is indeed good to be with you again. And Jake, I want to thank you for all that. That is just a wonderful overview, that much of which deals with not just regionalization, but also being United Methodist. I think many of us would benefit from that kind of thing. And so some people ask the question, what would change? Why does it matter? You see those bullet points in front of you, and each of them have their own uniqueness to it. And some of the things that change seem minor to us in the United States. Existing central conferences, and Jake went through where 8 of those are throughout the world, would be renamed as regional conferences. That is a somewhat easy piece, right? We're just renaming central conferences regional. There will be a new formation of a U.S. regional conference, right? and it's going to be created with the same powers that other regions have. And so there's an equalization around the world. You heard Bishop Tracy Malone in that video piece talk about a worldwide denomination. We need to be reclaiming that, or claiming that, some of us for the first time in our local churches and beyond, that we indeed are a worldwide denomination. And that's something I believe, and that I am humbly proud of, and I hope that you are as well. There's going to be an interim committee, and quite honestly, I don't know too much about that makeup of that, but there'll be an interim, although I'm very interested, an interim committee that's going to help the United States, right, transition smoothly into its own region. Now, one of the pieces that we need to remember that I'm not sure that we see anywhere scripted tonight is that in each of the existing central conferences that become a regional conference, if indeed this legislation is passed, they have the ability within their region to then form jurisdictional conferences. They don't need to do that. That would be based on their own kind of particular need and context. And so you can see thus far, what's going to change is really not too much. For us in the United States, we would form a new regional conference, which would be new to us as well. We could just move on to one slide next. Thank you, Matt. And so what can regional conferences do? Why does it matter to people in the church, right? What they can do is draft and publish a regional book of discipline, hymnals, and liturgical resources. Now, folks, many of you are not aware, to some degree that's being done already. And for those of you who are Methodist geeks, and those who are not, I would turn you to your book of discipline, where you would go to the Constitution of the United Methodist Church, and specifically go to paragraph 32.5. 32.5 gives the ability right now for central conferences to reject and amend the action of General Conference. And so in some way, presently, our central conferences work out of their own book of discipline that is already uniquely different than ours. Many people in their pews, and sometimes even behind our pulpits, aren't aware of that. And so this puts a real context to the fact that regional conferences would draft and publish a book that's authentic to them. They're able to set requirements for ordination and licensed ministry that reflect their needs and their resources. Jake gave you that wonderful example of what resourcing looks like from the standpoint of education and seminary around licensing and ordination, and it's drastically different in the United States than it is throughout the world. They're also going to be able to determine their own standards for lay membership, which is unique to where they find themselves. They're going to be able to develop practices for marriage, for funerals, and other rites in line with cultural norms and local laws. And it doesn't take too much imagination, does it, to think about what you perceive as a marriage or a wedding service somewhere like in Zimbabwe, where some of you mentioned you've been or know folks, in comparison that marriage service, right, and the laws around it in the United States. This gives them freedom to be culturally normative to conduct all those kind of rites. It also allows regions to reorganize their districts, their annual conferences, and charge conferences to best serve their mission. Folks, we know the best way to serve our mission in our context in central Pennsylvania, and we should not be able to speak for those around the world. And this gives the opportunity for regional conferences in this global denomination to reorganize themselves in that way. They're also able to convene regional judicial councils. It's a subtle point and a small sentence, but again, a judicial council that would be dedicated just to a particular region that could, again, make decisions based on location and context. You can see how ministry would be very different if that was allowed to happen. And they can also align conference policies with local legal framework. Someday, when you might not have anything else to do, I invite you to go to our book of discipline, the present book of discipline, or any book of discipline in the past, and start to look up the local work of the trustees, and then start to think about how much of this applies to me if I find myself in Uganda, or if I find myself in Philippines. And you'll quickly realize that much of that work for the trustees in the United States, which revolves around legal work, would not apply at all. And so this would allow regional conferences to develop and align, as it says, policies that work well, and therefore the church benefits in mission and ministry. And so those are some of the kind of things that a regional conference can do. As a reminder, none of that is new for central conferences. What is new is that the United States would finally have the same kind of authority. So all those kind of things we reviewed, central conferences are already doing We cannot do those things in the United States, but we would be allowed to be able to do that. In other words, worldwide regionalization is not about separation of the denomination, it's about equity and effectiveness. And you and I know effectiveness can lead to time and spirit movement where members worship Jesus Christ in our local churches. What the core of the United Methodist piece is a piece that almost reflects back onto what Jake was doing as he was building a foundation of who we are, right? So regardless if we are a region, I'm a region here in the United States and my friends are in a region in the Philippines, we share the same constitution. We hold to the same doctrinal standards and theological tasks, and we affirm the ministry of all Christians. Now, for some of you, that language is very familiar. And for some of you, you may literally be viewing tonight and say, I didn't know we had a United Methodist Constitution. Or what are our doctrinal standards and theological tasks? I invite you to go to the opening pages of the Book of Discipline that lay those out there for us. Also, we reaffirm the ministry of all Christians in that kind of place. And we're guided by the same social principles that were adapted by General Conference. That's the core of who we are, and those things do not change. So when regionalization might change our structure, these things don't change. They're not adaptable by any region, and so we lie safe and secure in those kind of places. And so that's a quick overview of the kind of things that change and what remain the same. Jake, I believe you're up.
Yeah. Sorry, caught me by surprise for a minute. I was enjoying your presentation. So we have so a few of the other things that we'll still share in common. So we would still share a common council of bishops, even if there were a regional judicial council to kind of make decisions about things that are only in a regional book of discipline. There would still be a worldwide judicial council that would rule on things that we hold in common. We would still hold General Conference together. The difference in General Conference, as I said earlier, would be that it would really only deal with things that affect all of the people who are gathered there at General Conference. We would still share our general agencies like the General Board of Church and Society, the General Board of Global Ministries, General Board of Higher Education and Ministry. We would still share in the connectional giving for our worldwide connectional giving offerings, like for United Methodist Committee on Relief and others. And we would still share in the common sacrament. So one of the questions that that some people have asked is why now, right? Why now? And some of this we've already heard in a couple of different ways. One, we're a growing, diverse, worldwide church. I mean, a vibrant worldwide church, right? And which again is very different from the time when the United Methodist Church started. It also takes time. There's also been over the last really 20 years or so at different gatherings and throughout the denomination, this recognition of this structural inequity between different regions and this desire as people from the United Methodists from the Central Conferences find their voice, to have an equal voice and an equal place at the table. Also, as you heard me say, the U.S.-centered piece of this puts a strain on General Conference legislative processes. It's basically inefficient and unwieldy. This will make that much cleaner, much more focused. And finally, this allows us to have some operational differences without and work out things in our own regions while preserving our unity in Christ and unity as United Methodists. All of these changes are geared towards helping us not just to survive, but to thrive as a worldwide denomination. And really, it is it's one and a piece of a lot of other things that we've been working on to make us a worldwide church. For example, like the revision of the social principles to reflect a worldwide church. And so we've been doing a lot of other things in that same common vein. And so this is basically the next step in that.
I hope that you're able to see that graph that's in front of you, that table showing our current structure and our proposed regionalization around three different things. One is U.S. authority. Right now, the United States holds a very privileged place in our structure, right? We have more authority, we have more representation, we even have more say in matters that affect the whole church. And so we would move from the U.S. authority, right, to one equal region among many. When it comes to disciplinary flexibility, The current structure is only outside of the United States, but this would allow all regions to have that flexibility to dictate what ministry and mission, right? What disciple making looks like, right, in their particular context. In general conference, Jake has said it several different times. We are overloaded with U.S. concerns, and we're happy to celebrate them. But to be quite honest, it's quite painful when you see your friends, your neighbors, and your siblings in Christ travel around from the world and literally sit in a room with no voice, if you will, no matter in what we're talking about. So regionalization would allow regions to be focused on mission and doctrine and unity as we spread kind of the wealth out, if you will, of voice outside the United States. And the power balance would certainly be equalized. We're a US dominant denomination. We understand that, but that has been changing and it's changing very quickly. And so the power balance would be shared worldwide. One of the things that it shifts is that the power, if you will, becomes more justly. Regionalization allows local realities to be more effective, and it literally frees the work of General Conference to focus on what unites us all together. And so there is a major difference as we look at how a US-centric denomination that calls itself worldwide would become regionalized. I believe Kathy's going to take us through some voting and process pieces as we head toward annual conference.
Yes, and if I can take us out of order just a little bit, we have a couple of questions that have come in that are specifically related to regionalization. We may be receiving more questions, but I wonder if we could pause and address these couple of questions before we get into the weeds with our voting process. So Jake and Gary, let me read the first question and ask if you'd be willing to respond. So the first is, what's the main reason someone might vote against regionalization?
Jake, can I throw a thought out?
Go for it.
I think that one of the reasons that someone might vote against it is literally a lack of knowledge, right? Now, hear me when I say that. It's not an ignorance, it's just simply a lack of knowledge. I know sitting here that the opening piece that Jake did for some, maybe many, but for some of us who gathered here, how the church is structured is new. We don't address that in any kind of normative way on Sundays or in our Sunday school classes. And so some of it is just simply a lack of knowledge. We hear, right? We hear the pastor and our church teachers and leaders talking about the worldwide denomination. So we assume that it's true in all places, and it's simply not. And so for Kathy, for some of me, it's just things like this help. The resources that we're going to give at the end, I think would help people understand it in a kind of greater way. Jake, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think for me, when I think about that, and I mean this in a charitable way as well, I think that there are a few misperceptions out there that that regionalization allows us just to that allows anywhere to just kind of believe anything we want and to change the doctrine of the United Methodist Church, and that's one of those pieces of misinformation that I know I've heard from some different places. And as you said on the previous one, our beliefs about Jesus Christ, Jesus' divinity, Jesus is the Lord of all, the role of the Bible, all of those are not going to change at all with regionalization, and none of that can be adapted in a region. So I think one of the things that I know in some conversations I've heard, there's sometimes out of a fear, right? That to change something that we might lose something, right? Or that we find important. And I think that at least in that point in terms of theological beliefs, our core things that we believe in our doctrine, those things do not change. So I think that that's one of the reasons that people might vote against it as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me ask the next question, please. Regional conferences can adapt anything in the Book of Discipline after paragraph 164? Question mark. Can you clarify that, please?
Gary, I opened up my Book of Discipline. I saw the question. So,
Okay.
so that is close to being, that is accurate in our current Book of Discipline. What I'd say is For those of you maybe who have never opened up a book of discipline, the book of discipline has 6 parts. And the 6th part begins with paragraph 201, organization and administration. Everything in part 6, organization and administration, can be adapted, and that begins with paragraph 201. That means those other 5 parts that Gary talked about are all cannot be adapted, and currently that ends at paragraph 164. I say that's almost accurate for those of you who do the Book of Discipline, because you could add 165, 166, and that no longer would be true. So basically, it's part 6 beginning in paragraph 201. Everything that has to do with organization and administration can be adapted in a central conference currently, and would be able to be adapted in a regional conference. Was that clear enough for people who have looked at the discipline? Yeah.
Great, thank you. And we have, it looks like one more question so far regarding regionalization. What will be the frequency and timing for meetings of the U.S. Regional Conference as compared with general conference sessions?
This might be a group effort. I don't know if I can directly answer around timing. I think frequency is every 4 years is what I'm remembering. The timing of that, I don't know. And I just want to admit that up front. We can get that. If Jake doesn't have a solid answer to that, we can get responses to that for folks.
No, but I agree. It's every 4 years would be the regular cycle. But yeah, I think the timing is still to be worked. I think there are some ideas about how that would work, but I don't think it's been finalized, really.
I think that's also some of the technical work that has to be done that will become more clear after the annual conference sessions and the voting happens and the status of this legislation. So some of that I think is yet to be clarified, but every 4 years is what I recall as well. Okay, and friends, as you have questions, please feel free to continue to put those into the Q&A, and we will do our best to continue to share answers. And as I believe it was Gary already alluded to, should you have a question for which we don't have an answer, we are happy to do a little bit of research on that and provide accurate information as we continue to move forward between now and annual conference. So I do want to spend a little bit of time and talk about the voting in the process. So this is a consequential decision that is before us, and because this legislation requires a change to constitutional amendments, it also requires broad consensus and broad support of the legislation itself. And so that signifies and points to the weight and the change of hope that is behind this. So here's how the voting process will work. First, this requires a 2/3 supermajority vote at General Conference. It did pass last year at General Conference with a 78% vote in favor. So the vote process more than exceeded that which was required. Then it goes to every United Methodist annual conference around the world, including those in the United States and each of the central conferences. And during all of our annual conference sessions, we will debate and discuss each of the proposed amendments according to our annual conference rules. So for us, that means that we are permitted to make speeches that are limited to 2 minutes in length. We're permitted to have a maximum of 3 speeches for and 3 speeches against each ballot item. And since this is coming to us as legislation from General Conference, we do not have the ability to make amendments or changes Our vote is on the legislation as it is presented. So we cannot make amendments, we cannot make changes. Every annual conference is voting on the same material without adjusting it. And we're going to vote on ballots with bubble sheets. So it will be the kind of filling in the little bubble of if we support or do not support, if we vote yes or no, if we vote up or down on each of the ballots. And we'll need to bring a black or a blue pen to color in the little bubble. This is not a time for us to be creative and use our crayons or pencils or if you have a loose lipstick in the bottom of your bag, not a time for that. And then after we vote, the ballots will be collected and counted and submitted to the Secretary of the General Conference. We will not know the results of our votes during the annual conference session. The amendment is only ratified if the aggregate vote across all annual conferences worldwide reaches the 2/3 supermajority threshold. And it's also important to remember that according to the Book of Discipline, only clergy who are in full connection and elected lay members of annual conference may vote. And so if any of us are unsure of our eligibility, please do reach out and let us help clarify if you are able to vote or not vote on these amendments, which is again a rule of the Book of Discipline.
Thank you, Kathy, for that. And all that the Kathy said is also true for the other amendments, right? And so as you log in next week to hear about other constitutional amendments, all that's true. So Kathy, thank you for that. Tonight and next week really is not simply about education. It's really about discernment. One of the things that I believe strongly, because I've experienced it and lived through it, not just as a superintendent, but also as a pastor and a person in the pews, is that churches and individuals in the pews make decisions very well, but they don't discern very well. I don't think we're challenged enough to go from decision making to discernment. And each of us does that in a very different and a very unique way. Some of us do that through faithful conversation or through scriptural study. Some of us do that developing other spiritual disciplines around that discernment, around fasting and silence and solitude. You know how you discern best. What we want to offer you this evening is, with all that you have heard and all that you might read, and maybe you even watch this recording again, maybe you share it with other individuals and you have a conversation in your church. As you start to discern, what would it be like if you focused around this one question? Will this help United Methodists around the world make more disciples? Will regionalization help United Methodists around the world make more disciples? So I want you to take a moment. You've heard that twice read by me. I want you in the privacy of your own space, or maybe in the silence of your own mind, to read that again. And now I invite you into a time of some quiet, possible prayer, if that's where your mind goes, as we look at that question for each and also for all of us. And so let us take some silence for a moment. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you. So we do want to continue to hear from you and to hear your questions. So please feel free to continue to put those into the Q&A. We have a few more minutes together, so we're happy to continue to answer them. We do have a few questions that have come in, and if we could talk through those. So one of them is, would we as the Susquehanna Conference then be electing delegates to the regional and then to the general conferences, or would they be one and the same? And so I'm happy to begin a response to that. So currently, what we do is the voting on delegates happens as based on the number that we are allotted, the number of delegates that we are permitted to have present for general conference and for jurisdictional conference. And so our process is that we vote first for our delegates to general conference because they also are our delegates to jurisdictional conference. And then once we've completed our slate of delegates to general conference, we continue voting until we have our full slate of delegates to the jurisdictional conference. And our delegates to the jurisdictional conference are also our alternates to the general conference. And so my best guess is that moving forward, should regionalization pass, that once we know what that structure will look like for the general conference, for the regional conference, once we know what the numbers would be for each annual conference for delegations, that we would have a streamlined as much as possible voting process. Because certainly those years that we vote for delegates to general and jurisdictional conference currently, that takes a lot of our time during our time together. And so we would have a streamlined process as possible to make sure that we had our delegates ready to represent us as an annual conference in this important work. Gary or Jake, would you want to add anything to that?
No, that's a great synopsis. I actually saw that in writing, and in writing it was much more difficult to understand than you just did it. So thank you so much.
Perfect. There's also a question that has come in regarding voting. And specifically, there's a clarification that local pastors are unable to vote on constitutional amendments, even though the constitutional amendments affect local pastors, and then raises a question around the purpose of local pastors still being present for annual conference. And so this is thank you for asking that question, for raising the question in the Q&A. Anytime that we have a constitutional amendment or any of the other votes that are restrictive on who can vote, this surfaces, and this is a conversation that we really need to have and we really need to clarify. So for constitutional amendments, the discipline says that clergy must be in full connection. So that means local pastors, that means provisional members who are not yet in full connection are unable to vote. But that's only on these restricted matters, so the matters of the constitutional amendments. And there are places that different categories of local pastors are eligible or ineligible to vote. For example, local pastors who have completed education, so a course of study or an MDiv, and have fulfilled 2 years of serving are able to vote on clergy delegates to general and jurisdictional conference currently. And so it's a different set of expectation. But the rest of the business that will happen during our annual conference session, every clergy member who is present is able to vote. It is just when we are voting on the constitutional amendments. However, and Gary and Jake, if you could please check me on this, I have not read that local pastors are limited in voice during this conversation. Have you?
That's a wonderful question, Kathy. I have not read that either. I would assume that they would continue to have voice. I think we can look into that so that we're very clear going into our time together. But they wouldn't have voice. I might say also, and like you, I want to thank Angie for the question. Some of you know that Kathleen Kine also sits as the chairperson for the sessions committee that does the planning of annual conference from the smallest of details to the largest of gatherings. And so, Kathy, can you, all the amendments, all 4 amendments we're looking at, what amount of time has been given to us to care for them?
To introduce the amendments, to discuss them, to vote on them, 90 minutes.
So, Angie, I would really press upon you that we're together for what, 2.5 days, and we're talking about 90 minutes. Now, I also, by saying that, I am not at all trying to relieve or take any angst or pain that you have in this, because I understand that. But when you asked like specifically, why would a licensed pastor go? Because annual conference gathering is about so much more, right, than these important issues. I want to remind us all, also on the call and even beyond for those who might watch the recording, is that as we were doing our discernment around the call of ministry, these things were true then as they are today, right? These are not things that just got developed 4 years or 8 years ago. It has been long in our history that this is the way voting has been. So Angie, for you and even for me at a much older age, when I was doing discerning, these kind of rules, if you were there. I just kind of want to offer that. I think it relates to Ray Baylor's question that lay members at large do get to vote because they are within the lay of the conference. So Ray, thank you for that, as well as Angie's question.
Yes, to clarify regarding all of our laity, lay members at large, lay members who are present because they are representing their local church, their local charge, CLMs who are members at large are all eligible to vote. Where there are specific rules is among our clergy. Are there any other questions?
Could I just add one piece to that
Please.
to that discussion real quick? Just to say that this is one of the things that at the last general conference, and I'm assuming the next general conference does come up as a question. So there is debate, and you can petitions can be submitted to the next general conference to change those voting rights. And there was a lot of conversation about that at General Conference this year, and it did not pass, partially because, it did not pass. And so, but I think there was some discussion that I think there's some movement to bring that back to the next General Conference. So that is something that could change at a future General Conference as well, and that anyone from here could you could put a petition through to do that at the next General Conference.
And I think, Jake, that's something we would encourage. The only way to make changes to the Book of Discipline is to have that legislation before the General Conference. I'm just looking real quick to see if there are any other questions coming in the Q&A. So as a local licensed pastor, by encouraging my lay delegate to vote yes, would regionalization eventually benefit us and give us a voice?
I think that's a matter of legislation, right? Just like Jake and Kathy both have affirmed, someone has to offer that legislation to the conference. And we have seen pieces from individuals, from local churches, from annual conferences rise up throughout the years to general conference, to regional conference, right? And make a difference, right? So, and no one can predict. I think we all understand that no one can predict what a gathering of people that we call an annual conference or jurisdiction, regional or general will do. So I don't think we're able to answer that directly with a yes or a no, but the reality is the possibilities there, as Jake was saying earlier, if you just, the conversation is alive and well, which we appreciate, right? We want to keep that as a lively conversation. We just need people to continue, right, to offer legislation around it.
And friends, there's a reality in our annual conference. Many of our congregations are being led faithfully and served faithfully and effectively by local pastors, who are bivocational and working a day job and serving in the church part-time. CLMs, we have DS hires, we have lots of folks who are serving very faithfully, and your ministry is important, and we we benefit from that leadership. And I think that we need to
Amen.
just recognize that out loud.
Amen.
We will not know our annual conference vote when we leave, so should we be prepared for that? Is this only on the regionalization amendment? Correct. We will not know the results of the vote on any of the constitutional amendment votes. So there are 4 constitutional amendment ballots that will be before us during our annual conference session, and we will not know the Susquehanna results. The results are only sent to the secretary, to the general conference, so that all of the annual conference results can be added together.
Yeah, and that's true, right, Kathy? There is actually never supposed to be an individual annual conference vote, even after all the things are tallied, shared.
So, Jake, that's interesting, because there exists, I believe it was a News Service article that shared the vote results from 2016
That's right.
constitutional amendments, and it was annual conference vote
Okay.
totals.
Yeah.
So, um,
Maybe at some time in the future. I had like part of the way I understand the reason that we don't know that. So you have to imagine the annual conferences. So it's actually going to take some time, right, for us to know the vote, because annual conferences don't all meet the same week. Actually, the annual conferences to vote on this will meet all the way from this spring all the way to next winter, through next winter. And spring for some of the different regions of the world. And so part of what I've heard is the logic of not sharing that is, it's if say that the last 2 annual conferences to vote see that the votes are moving a certain way, that could either influence them to think their vote doesn't matter, and so why even vote, or to vote in a particular way to change affect what's been happening already. And so it actually puts everybody on an equal footing. Nobody, when they're voting, knows where the total is until all of them have been received, which will take a year and a half. Yeah.
yes. Okay, so it is possible, if you are like me, that you will leave this conversation and 2 minutes later have a question that surfaces for you. And if that's the case, we still want to be able to provide answers. It is also possible that you will find answers in some of the places where resources exist. So, what I would offer to you is this. If there are questions that surface, please feel free to reach out to us with those questions so that we can provide as much accurate information as possible. And I want to offer up these possible next steps. So, There are some suggested resources, some possible next steps. We encourage reading the full legislation. It can be found starting on page 120 of the pre-conference workbook. Explore the United Methodist Church's regionalization hub, which can be found online at Resource UMC. You can visit the website Amendments Hub, which can be found on our annual conference page. So if you go to the Susquehanna conference page and look up at the annual conference page, there's lots of information. Please feel free to have conversations with any of the members of the General Conference delegation, and also to seek any kind of clarification, but also talk with one another from within your churches, your clusters, your communities of your delegates, your members to the annual conference session, so that everybody is informed and on the same page. And you might even want to host a church-wide forum to seek feedback from the congregation and to share this information with church leaders. This will be posted, this webinar will be posted on our conference website, where we have all of our annual conference information. So you'll have access to this. There also is another webinar next week, so Thursday at the same time at 6:30, and we will talk about the next 3 ballots. So we'll cover more information, and we invite you to be here for that and to bring your questions. And so let me give just one more look to our Q&A. So there's a question about how do you write a petition to make a change? So petitions get written for the general conference, and there is a bit of a format for how that is to be. But we would be very happy to show you samples of what has been submitted previously, so you can see what that format is. Then approaching the general conference, there will be instructions on exactly how to submit any kind of legislation that goes to the general conference. But that's something that we are more than happy to help provide some guidance and some samples, and then make sure that when we're approaching general conference and legislation would be due, that you're able to submit something. So that's something we can work on offline. Okay, friends, so checking the room. I believe we have responded to the questions. Jake and Gary, thank you so much for being with us and for not only spending this time, but sharing your experience, your research, the work that you have done to this point to better understand regionalization and translate it for our hearing and understanding. Your time with us has been so helpful. Matthew Shinneman, thank you so much also for keeping us together and guiding us through this conversation. We are blessed that you said yes to serving as our Director of Communications. Thank you for that. And friends, thank you for joining us this evening. It is so good to see you all. Have a good night.